listening to the 10 Questions with the Musical Mind podcast with your host, Peter Harris.
Hey everybody, welcome back to 10 Questions with the Musical Mind. I am Peter Harris, your host. In this episode, we welcome legendary radio personality Donna Halper. In addition to her long career in radio, she is also a professor and the author of many books, including Full Service Radio, Invisible Stars, and Icons of Talk, just to name a few of them. So, more to our interest as this audience goes, she's also the woman most famously known to the music public as the person who discovered the band Rush and first put them on the airwaves here in America back in 1974. So she's maintained a 40-year friendship with the band, and we discuss, how they got started, what they're like when they were a young and hungry band, and how their looks evolved over the years, and their plans now, what they're doing now that they are basically semi-retired. Also, we talk about the past and future, possibly, of radio, and the state of journalism today. So we have a pretty far-ranging conversation. It's really fascinating. So I think you'll enjoy this. So let's get in touch and see what Donna Halper has to say. Hello, Donna. How are you today?
Yes, I think it's incredibly cool. Thank you, particularly since your podcast is generally like for songwriters and stuff. And I used to write songs when I was a kid, but
Sure.
Mostly I appreciate songs, and I was a music director and a DJ, and I played a lot of songs. So this is very cool for me. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. The pleasure is mine. I just find all the areas of music fascinating, as well as history. And you are just as much of a historian as you are a radio personality, that kind of thing. So you've got fantastic credentials in both areas. So you are definitely somebody I wanted to have a conversation with. And to get people started, I'm sure a lot of people know who you are.
But you think I know who I am.
Right. No, I'm not fooled, but the general public may be.
Okay.
For those who don't know, you were the first female broadcaster at Northeastern University, 1968, is that correct?
4 years to persuade them to let me on the air, because somehow I guess the Republic would have fallen if people heard a female voice on the air.
It would have disintegrated the Constitution as we know it, yes.
Well, it did. That's why we have problems.
Right. So what can you share briefly about those early days? Like what it took for you to get in? Did you see yourself as, I'm going to make a pioneering move, or was it just a personal goal?
Well, if you talk to most famous people, and I'm not famous, I'm nearly famous, I'm infamous perhaps, but with certain people who have listened to me over the years or have read my stuff, I'm, I guess, semi-famous. But to the average person out there, put me next to Beyonce. Most people have heard of Beyonce. Most people have not heard of me. But even Beyonce, I don't think Beyonce woke up on a Thursday and said, hey, you know what? That at a certain point in your life, in some people it's childhood, in some people it's when they get to college, who knows? But it's different for every person. In my case, I knew from the time I was 4 that I was different, okay? And I don't mean different in terms of sexuality or, just I was different. The things that girls were supposed to like,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like. The things that boys were supposed to like, I liked.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I was pretty aware I was a girl. I've always been heterosexual, all those stereotypes, I just couldn't buy into them.
Sure.
And I saw that, girls are supposed to like makeup and dresses, couldn't stand makeup, still won't wear it. I'll wear a dress if I absolutely must, but I'm much more comfortable in jeans. And that was kind of radical back in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is, I didn't intend to be radical. I just intended to be Donna. And I liked cowboys. I didn't like romance. It wasn't that I was against it. I liked action movies. I liked things that were, exciting. And I loved rock and roll.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a very lonely kid. Being different in the 50s wasn't easy. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. I was the only Jew in my neighborhood. I was, like I said, different from most of the girls who were mainly like all excited about getting a boyfriend. I was fine about getting a boyfriend. I just wanted to have a career. And
Sure.
I didn't want to be a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary. Not that there was anything wrong with that, but it wasn't me.
Right.
I
It
also
didn't
didn't
speak to
want
you.
to be a mom. I knew from the time I was 4 that I didn't want to have kids. And I don't know where I got that from. I've said this before, okay? All I saw around me were traditional women. I mean, women who married young because if they did go to college, just went to be, like I said, teachers, nurses, or secretaries. My mother was a traditional stay-at-home housewife. God rest her soul, wonderful person. But I knew from the time I was a kid, that's not what I wanted. And what spoke to me were the DJs.
Mhm.
And I don't mean that as a bad pun. I mean that like
Right.
when I would listen to the radio, I was like, wow, what a great job. I want to do that. I didn't hear any women DJs. I heard women doing cooking shows. I heard women doing fashion. I couldn't have cared less. I just wanted to play the hits. And I didn't realize that was revolutionary or radical. I just thought, like, what a great job. I'm this lonely kid living in Roslindale, Massachusetts, and, born 10 years too soon or whatever.
Sure.
I mean, if I'd been born in the 60s, growing up in the 70s, the idea of being a female DJ would have been like, oh, whatever. But in the 50s, not so much. And like I said, I never realized that this would be a radical gesture on my part. I just figured I'll go to college. And when I get there, I'll go to the college radio station and I'll just like, hey, I'm ready
here
to be a DJ.
Right.
I figured the reason I didn't hear any female DJs was maybe they hadn't raised their hand. I was ready to raise mine. I knew that's what I wanted.
Sure.
And I had no idea that there weren't very many female DJs because, God bless them, the guys that were in the industry had this belief that women's voices didn't sound good on the radio. That's what I was told. I was told I could not be a DJ because women DJs didn't sound good. And I asked the folks at the station, well, how many of you had on the air? And they said, none, they don't sound good, which struck me as catch-22.
Sure.
But it led to my embarking upon a 4-year battle that culminated in my senior year in October of 1968 in my becoming the first female DJ at Northeastern University. And somehow the Republic didn't fall. I mean, life went on as before,
Right.
except I was finally able to play the hits and make people happy.
Now, at a college radio station in those days, did you have any kind of leeway with the playlist, or was it, here's what you're playing this hour?
At first, the station I was at was very rigid. It was a typical top 40 station. You played what was on the playlist.
Mm-hmm.
But I was also the music director, which was a very cool job that I knew nothing about. And it was like, oh, great, I get to hear the songs before anybody. How cool is this? And society was changing. You're talking late 60s,
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam War. You're talking civil rights movement, women's rights movement, gay rights movement. Various social movements are all starting to really take off. I mean, yeah, they've been around before, but there's this confluence of social change and a lot of anti-war protesters and yada, yada. Long story short, the folks at the station, of which I was only one, this was not just my brilliant idea.
Sure.
It was a whole bunch of people's brilliant idea. We figured out that our generation didn't want to just hear the same 30 songs over and over. There were a lot of great album songs being put out,
Right.
and people weren't playing them in most cities. So a couple of stations nationwide started playing what came to be known as album rock. Back then it was called progressive rock or underground music.
Mm-hmm.
And we were getting in all of these great albums. Why aren't we playing these? And so gradually we started changing over from top 40 and we became more of an album rock kind of station.
Okay.
And I had tremendous freedom to play a lot of the stuff I wanted because, like I said, I was the music director. So if I heard a good song, the program director trusted me to make the right decision and play what was right for our audience. And that's what I tried to do.
That's great. Now, talk about that, and it's gone. we'll circle back around to that because it's gone through some changes since that time. But going back to one of your many books, Invisible Stars, you were covering the early days of radio, and it, had a lot to do with the early women in radio. But one thing I want to touch on is that it's sort of the haphazard programming. I mean, and it's to be expected with a new medium, but you kind of highlight how these radio stations were only on for a few hours a day, and basically they had to find things to put on the air, live musicians, that kind of thing. At what point did radio begin to segment into formats? At what point did it become organized enough to go, okay, we're going to be jazz, we're going to be classical, we're going to be big band? Did that happen in the late 20s or?
Really good question. And I'm glad you asked it. And I know that sounds very like, oh, I'm glad you asked that question. But there really is a period of time where in the early days of any mass medium, we've seen this with the internet.
Sure.
In the early days of any mass medium, it's kind of like the wild, wild west.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody just sort of does their own thing because there aren't any rules.
Right.
And, people today look back on, oh my God, it took 15 minutes to download a file back in those early days of that. But you had nothing to compare it with.
Exactly.
So the fact that it took 15 minutes was like, my God, you could get it in the same 15 minutes, where before you had to wait a couple of days to maybe buy it.
Right.
Like, 15 minutes? Is there this much wonderfulness in the world? So early radio was like that. Early radio was block programming. Okay, in other words, you did 15-minute blocks of time, 15-minute increments.
Okay.
So you might hear 15 minutes of jazz, or 15 minutes of classical, or 15 minutes of some soprano hoping for the best, or 15 minutes of a comedian. And the reason was it was free. And while free is always good, the big talent wanted to be paid.
Sure.
And early radio didn't have a ton of budget. So it was like they were, how would you like to be on a radio station? And most famous people were like, well, why would I? Whereas a lot of the up and coming folks were like, wow, this would look good on a resume. Sure.
Right.
So you're getting whoever wanted to come on down. And there were a few famous people who did, in fact, go on the radio. Eddie Cantor, the famous comedian. There were a few here and there who were just like, okay, it might be kind of amusing to say that I went on this new mass medium. But mostly it was just up-and-coming people and local people. And radio, to some degree, made stars out of people that you wouldn't have expected, men as well as women. Here in Boston, I also wrote a book about Boston radio.
Mm-hmm.
And here in Boston, we had this rabbi, okay? His name was Rabbi Harry Levy. And he was a rabbi, and he was from Boston. And so what, Donna? Well, he went on the radio. And all of a sudden, people who had never heard a rabbi, don't forget, this is the 1920s. Okay. The church is still teaching that there's no salvation outside the church.
Right.
Catholics aren't hanging out with Protestants, who aren't hanging out with Jews, who have never met a Muslim, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly people are turning on their radio. And again, talk about the Republic didn't fall.
Right.
People are just, what? So that's... he sounds pretty sane.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't sound like all the stuff I was told about rabbis.
Right. He sounds pretty normal.
Cool. And where is he preaching? Oh, Temple Israel in Boston. How do I get there? Okay. And suddenly, Rabbi Levy, to his great surprise, is having all these people that heard him on the radio showing up at his synagogue asking for autographs. Okay. By 1929, half of his congregation is people that heard him on the radio. And 20% of them aren't even Jewish. They just show up every week because they like his sermons. And he had to issue 2 books of his sermons. My point is, most people never expected that by being on the radio, they'd become famous. So it happened with music. It happened with religion. Mm-hmm. It happened with business. You were hearing all kinds of locally famous people, some of whom went on to become nationally famous, okay? So when the networks came along in 1926 and 1927, first NBC, which back then was not called NBC, it was called the National Broadcasting Company, and then CBS, which wasn't called CBS, it was the Columbia Broadcasting System. When they came along, they had money and they were going to pay people. And they didn't want some local rabbi, no offense to the rabbi. They didn't want some local soprano, no offense to the soprano.
Right.
They wanted the biggest names, the most famous comedians, the most famous band leaders, and they would pay $1 to get them. And because money was getting thrown around, suddenly there needed to be formats. Suddenly there needed to be, well, every night we're going to have specific programs because people are going to start expecting that they're going to hear Jack Benny, or they're going to hear Burns and Allen, or they're going to hear Irving Berlin, or whoever, Jessica Dragonette, who was a very famous singer in the late 1920s. People start expecting it. So NBC and CBS start formatting things in a specific way so that like every evening you know what you're going to hear. And the days of freeform start kind of fading into oblivion as radio becomes more professionalized. Sure. Now that's a mixed blessing. You lose a lot of the rough edges and you start hearing like the best of the best, but you also kind of no longer hear those up and coming people, and you can go, wow, I'll bet you that one's going to happen. That one's going to be famous. That one. So the local stations have a moment of crisis here. Do they continue to just play whatever they can get? Right. Do they try to compete with the network? What do they do? And you start seeing in the 30s, when the Depression is going on and radio becomes the great escape for people, a lot of the local stations just carve out a niche for themselves as, hey, you can hear the new up-and-coming voices here, and we'll give you the best of the local people, and you want to hear them before they become famous. And we've got local people who are famous, and they're going to come back and talk directly to you. And so they made a name for themselves as kind of like the hometown voice, the personalities. Other stations, they knew they couldn't compete. Mm-hmm. So they just signed an affiliate agreement with the networks. Okay. Maybe they had a live morning show, and then the rest of the time, it was just network program. Right. One of the women I talk about in my book is Halloween Martin. Uh-huh. And that really was her name. She was born on Halloween. And Halloween Martin in 1929 did the first morning show that we know about. Now, yeah, there were stations on the air in the morning by that time. Right. But she did like time and temperature and up-tempo music, and she took requests, and, she greeted everybody, and she, really got in touch with the audience by name. And, hey, Nick from Chicago just got in touch, and he wants to hear such and such, and that kind of thing. And that, we associate that with like the 50s and 60s. She was doing it in 1929 in Chicago on a station called KYW, which later moved to Philadelphia. But she stayed in Chicago and had like a 2-decade career doing morning shows. And she became like the voice of the morning. So for many people, it was a companion. And they weren't sitting there going, this doesn't sound like NBC. This sounds like my hometown, and I like it. I'm hearing all the local people. So that's where I think your stations start to diverge. By the time you're into the 30s, the networks are really dominant. It's the golden age of radio, the age of radio dramas, and serials, the great comedy and variety shows and sports broadcasting, and you can hear the World Series from coast to coast. But like I said, locally, there are still local stations doing live and local and having a great time with it.
Well, think about it must have been so unusual for any human being in the early days of radio. That was the first time a mass media came along where there was not instant feedback from your audience.
One thing that radio did that no other mass medium to that point had done is take you to the event in real time. Right. Like before radio, you got newspapers, you got magazines. Right. Now, newspapers, they could put out 10 or 11 editions a day. And back in the old days, they did. Right. Okay. Every time there was a baseball game, you would see up on the front. If you have a public library, you can go to your public library and see some of the old newspapers, plus many of them have been digitized now.
Morning edition, late edition.
Look on the front page. It's 4th inning, and then there's a new edition a couple of hours later, 6th inning. But radio, took you right to the game as it was happening. It took you to Rabbi Levy's synagogue as he was giving his sermon. It took you to Annie Jump Cannon, who was, her middle name was Jump, which is a family name. Her last name was Cannon. Annie Jump Cannon was an astronomer. She was from Harvard. You could listen. And you're a Joe or Jane citizen living out in the rural areas of Massachusetts. The chances of your taking a course with a Harvard astronomer, slim, fat, and none.
Right.
And Slim just left town. You know what I'm saying? So you're just tuning in one night and here's this Harvard astronomer talking about the stars.
Right.
OMG. People are amazed. So that kind of thing was happening all over the place. And we take this for granted today, but back then it was the first time when a mass medium not only brought you to the event in real time, but gave you access to people you never would have heard their voices. You were able to hear the president, and we have nothing to fear but fear. He delivered that live. Right. You heard him say it. The fireside chats were a thing. They were meant to invoke in Congress. You didn't have to have a fireside, but mentally, it was theater of the imagination. You could imagine just sitting in your living room, and there's the president just telling you, don't worry, it's all going to be okay. We're going to get through this depression. Right. Now, agreed. Radio did not take the place of newspaper. If you've ever studied a school of thought called media ecology, I'm a big fan of the late, great Neil Postman. He wrote a wonderful book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. He wrote 20 books. But Neil Postman talked about media ecology, and he said, a new mass medium does not eradicate all the other mass media, but it competes with them for time and attention. Sure. So newspapers had to change because of radio. And radio had to change because of newspaper, but one did not erase the other. The newspapers were like, oh my God, we're done now. Right. Except you're a baseball fan. You listen to the game, and then you want to read what your favorite sports writer said about it. Sure. You want to see if somebody got an interview. You want to see what these particular people had to say or what they thought. And you're sitting there like, God, this is great. I got to hear the game, and now I get to read all of these amazing opinions and reports about it. And every city had media critics. Every city had sports writers. Every city had people who were just the adjunct to what you had just listened to. So rather than replacing it, it enhanced it.
Right. I think it's interesting also is what I was alluding to earlier was it had to be weird for the personalities, because it was the first time a medium came along where they didn't have instant feedback from their audience. If you're a stage actor, anything like that, the audience laughs or doesn't laugh or groans. If you're, obviously newspaper writers wouldn't get immediate feedback, but it had to be a new experience to talk into a microphone and not know if there's 8 people listening to you or 8,000.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because there were a lot of newspaper articles where radio entertainers expressed their concern about speaking to the, quote, invisible audience. Sure. And what this led to is studio audiences. Okay. There was a comedian. His name was Ed Wynn, Wynn, for those that want to go look it up. And if you check out his career, he was one of the first famous people, and he was famous in his day. He was one of the most famous local stage comedians of that era. He came from vaudeville, and he went on radio as early as 1922. Okay. You got to go on the radio and just stand in this room and talk into this microphone. He said, forget about it. I'm not doing it. Right. And the radio station, which was, I believe, WJZ, didn't want to lose the opportunity of having the famous Ed Wynn, because it was so hard to get famous people to come on radio in those early days because they couldn't pay him. He was just doing it for the publicity. So the program director, who I believe was Tommy Cowan, and I could be wrong, so Tommy Cowan said to him, what do you need? What do you need? And he said, I need an audience. And so they rounded up the cleaners. They walked down the street. They said, hey, want to hear a free Ed Wynn concert? And they just got a whole bunch of people to sit in a room so that Ed Wynn could have somebody to tell his jokes to.
Some kind of feedback, right?
Yeah. But it didn't come along until the late 1920s when a lot of regular studio audiences, for the most part, in the early days, no, you just hoped for the best and you just imagined that there were people listening. And you got your feedback from something called applause cards. And applause cards were literally sent to you to applaud your broadcast. They were postcards, and you sent it to, so let's say that you heard the famous soprano Jane Jones, and you liked Jane Jones. So you'd get down to your favorite record store, and you'd get an applause card from them, and you go, I applaud, and it lets you fill in the name of the person, and you tell why you applaud that person, and you send it to the station. And there were stations that calculated bonuses and raises based on how many applause cards you got. So that was one of the earliest form of feedback. I actually have some applause cards in my collection, and when I give talks,
early form
I
of
bring out stuff like that.
Yeah, trying to figure out what's working and not. Yeah.
They also took telegrams. Okay, the wealthier people had telephones. Not everybody did back then, but the wealthy people had telephones, so they would call, and other people would go to the telegraph office and send a telegram. Everybody else would send applause cards. But yeah, it was delayed feedback, except for the folks that could telephone. But even that was delayed because obviously the receptionist wasn't going to put you on the air live. A, it would have sounded horrible. And B, there was no guarantee that you were, somebody that was going to make any sense. So people would take down the message and then run it into the studio. But yeah, until they were able in the mid-1930s to take some calls live, and even then it was kind of an iffy procedure.
Well, back then you probably also had party lines.
Studio audiences, and that's how you got your feedback. And that doesn't really start becoming more common till the network just put them into some of the studios in the 30s at the request of the artists.
Right. And talk about the phone calls. Also, they had a lot of party lines then. So you're not going to put someone in the air and somebody down the street picks up the phone.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's funny.
And the quality of the call would have been awful too, okay? Even if it wasn't a party line. Let's say you were, Miri Millionaire, okay? Bernie Billionaire. And you called up and you had a single line, God bless you. The quality of the calls back then would not have been really good.
No.
And they're using carbon microphones, or even later when they're using the next generation of microphones, it still sounds horrible.
Sure.
So by and large, they just didn't put calls on the air, and you're not going to start really hearing calls on the air on a regular basis till the late 30s, early 40s. And then the FCC gets involved and says, oh no, you got to let people know your call, got to have a beep, so that some of you, the older listeners may remember, you'd hear people talking beep, but they know they're calling in. They're expecting to be on the air. No, it took until 1972, I think, before the FCC finally let radio stations just take calls without that annoying beep.
We don't talk about the
radio stations created a delay.
Right.
So that talk shows, because in the 60s, and by the way, it's a myth that there were no conservative talk shows. I've read on some website, it was all liberals. No, it wasn't. They had liberals, they had conservatives, they had everybody. But the reality is, whether you were liberal or conservative, there was always at least one Looney Tune who wanted to call up and drop the F-bomb on the air. And as a result, engineers, by the mid-1960s, had figured out we need a delay.
Sure.
And so they created a delay system of 7 seconds, 10 seconds, where what you were hearing on the air, so if somebody did in fact drop the F-bomb, they could just, boom, you're gone. You're squashed like a bug.
I personally think that's
DJ never went out over the air.
That's an invaluable invention, actually. That's very useful, I think. But talk about the FCC. I'm going to go off on a tangent here, and I apologize. But you may be the person to ask this. When I was on radio, I was told that the reason we still had to give the station identification at the top of the hour was dating back to the rules when you had to give that station identification, where in the early days of aviation, a pilot could tune in and know where he was if it was too cloudy to see the cities before radar. Is there any
that
truth
may
to
be, I
that?
like that story. That's as good a story as any other
Sure.
that I've heard. But I heard it was because of the ships at sea.
Okay.
In the early days, radio shared a frequency with the ships at sea.
Okay.
Okay, there was no FRC, the Federal Radio Commission, till 1927. What there was the Department of Commerce, which supervised the ships at sea and the fish and everything else. And it is a fact that there were very few frequencies allocated in those early days. There are entire websites that speak more about this than I ever could, okay? Your listeners will have no problem finding information about those early days. I can send around some websites that would be useful. But long story short, the original frequencies, there were only about 2 of them that the Department of Commerce made available to radio. Back then, radio was only on the air at night. Mm-hmm. It's only on the air for limited hours in the early 1920s. And like I said, they shared it with the ships at sea. So if the ships at sea needed a frequency because they were trying to get weather so that the ships at sea could broadcast, it was quite surreal. But again, nobody had anything to compare it with. The call letters, those go back to the Radio Act of 1912. Mm-hmm. And I've been known to ask my students what year was the Radio Act of 1912, and there actually were some who did not know. But the Radio Act of 1912 was put into place after the Titanic, which there were onboard radio stations. And when I say radio station, back then, radio doesn't play the hits. Back then, radio is Morse code, right, and it gives the weather and sometimes medical advice and directions, and there was no expectation that this was going to be a medium that played the hits. And in 1912, as I'm sure you know, there were ships that knew an iceberg was dead ahead, right, but not all the ships an awake Morse code operator to send out signals. And there were ships that sailed by the Titanic, and nothing happened. The people that needed to be warned weren't warned, right, because it was all voluntary. After the Titanic, the federal government made it mandatory that you had to have a ship radio station with an awake operator 24/7. I mean, not the same person, but I mean shifts, like 8-hour shifts. So if in fact there was an iceberg dead ahead, every single ship in the area would have an awake operator who could get the message and warn everyone in time. No more of this voluntary stuff. Right. Now, how do you tell one station from another? How do you tell one ship from another? The Department of Commerce starts handing out call letters. And they were in sequential order, WAA, WAB, WAE, WAD, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the ship radio stations would use the Morse code letters to identify their station. And that's how people knew which ship was in trouble and so on and so on. A lot of the early days of radio takes from customs that were used by ham radio, because a lot of the early broadcasters were hams. They were amateurs. There was no commercial broadcasting yet. So as a result, you didn't say your name. You said your initials, because that's what you did on shipboard radio stations. Okay. And you basically used your call letters. So we had a lot of the early broadcasters who the only way people knew them was by their initials. And, Tommy Cowan was, I believe, ACN, Announcer Cowan, New York, or Newark or something of that nature. But you get the general idea. Sure. If I ADH, Announcer Donna Halper, and I would have Morse coded that out whenever I was asked to. So, I really do believe that a lot of those early customs and traditions just got put into place from the early Morse code days and from the early ships at sea days. And by the time the mid-20s roll around, it's like, we've always done it this way. And
Right.
no one was quite sure why we'd always done it this way, but my God, we'd always done it this way.
Well, in ship-to-ship radio, when it's basically relaying important and perhaps emergency information, you don't want the operator to spend half the time deciphering the broadcaster's name.
Absolutely.
Sure.
So my point is that by the 1930s, we're still doing stuff like
Right.
that, and there's no more ships at sea sharing the frequency with us.
Right.
There's no more Morse code on radio. I mean, in the early days of radio, you have code practice. Go online to some of the databases that are digitized. They will be stunned to see that in 1922 or 1923, just about every station had what was called code practice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm talking like regular stations that are playing music, and yet a couple of times an hour, they got Morse code practice. Because first of all, in order to get your license, you had to have an operator who knew Morse code in the event that you had to communicate with the ships at sea. And at that point in time, Morse code is still really, really important, okay? And that custom is going to linger on through the 40s and 50s,
Right.
okay? When I went to get my license, I still had to learn Morse code,
Really?
okay? And I'm sitting there like, there's a reason for this, I'm sure, but I don't know what it is. But gradually, some of these customs change. The first battle was over names. There were a number of announcers. There's no called a DJ back then. The word DJ doesn't come into common use till the 1940s.
Okay.
Late 40s. Okay. Back then, you're an announcer. And the announcers start getting fan mail.
Right.
And they want to use their name. They're human. Okay. They don't want to be ADH. They want to be Donna Halper. They want to be Tommy Cowan. They want to be whoever. There were a few announcers who kind of pushed the envelope. By the way, we see this in newspapers too. The early newspapers didn't want to give reporters bylines because they were afraid if they let them use their name, they'd ask for more money. They'd become famous.
You covered that in your book too, about the radio. Yeah.
If you're doing research into early broadcasting, you get the same problem. A lot of initials and not a lot of names.
Right.
But by the mid-20s, there's kind of this revolt going on.
Right.
And it's like, I want to use my name. And by the late 20s, everybody's using their name.
Right.
When the Federal Radio Commission, which is the precursor to the Federal Communications Commission, when they come along, the Federal Radio Commission, they make sure that every station has call letters. They make sure that everybody's got a frequency they can use. They make sure that everybody has a certain amount of power. In other words, they start professionalizing it. Now, I get really excited about this, but I hope that your listeners who are accustomed to talking songwriting are not like, oh my God, what did I tune into?
Yeah. No. It's fascinating. And I want to go over, before we get into some other questions, I'd love to know your opinion on the 1996 Telecommunications Act.
I hate it.
Because this has been a thing I've railed against for...
Let me repeat. I hate it.
Oh, good.
Let me say that again. I hate it.
It's long been my opinion.
It just aren't quite sure how I really feel about it. I hate it.
So you're saying you like it?
Yeah, I'm trying to be subtle here. Okay, I'm just like kind of.
It's been my opinion, and I've stated this.
Sort of, like
it destroyed radio.
It caused me to have to reinvent myself and get out of the industry. About 20,000 of us lost our jobs.
Right.
It made it possible for 6 giant conglomerates to dominate the industry.
Right.
It got rid of live and local broadcasting. Now, I'm not saying, okay, because I'm not quite as dumb as I seem. I'm not saying that if the Telecom Act had not come along, that radio would be as powerful now in the internet age. No, it wouldn't. It would have the same problems that many other mass media have had when they suddenly got competition. But the thing that made radio so important was that it was live and local most of the time.
Right.
And agreed, some stations were taking affiliate programs. I get that. But by and large, local radio stations and radio personalities who were the lifeblood of the community, you knew who they were. You saw them around town, et cetera, et cetera. The Telecom Act made voice tracking possible. Right. Now, again, voice tracking, automation, this stuff existed. But now the small and medium markets where I made much of my living as a radio consultant, those stations had the incentive to just sell out to one of the big stations, which just rebroadcast what they were having.
Right.
And you suddenly had live and local go the way of the dinosaur. And with no live and local in many cities, with Rush Limbaugh airing on 660 stations, and I'm not dissing Rush. It could have been, it doesn't have to be Limbaugh. I'm just using him because he was one good example. There were Howard Stern, okay? There were a multitude of big conglomerates in city after city after city, to the point where, why would I listen to this?
Right.
This is not my community. This is not my town. And unfortunately, that's what happened. Radio killed the goose that laid the golden egg. It made a lot of money for a very few people, and the rest of us lost our jobs. What ended up happening is many radio stations, because there's nothing unique about them anymore, when internet radio came along, when podcasting came along, when Spotify and Pandora came along, I'm not saying that radio would have been able to compete at the same level. But I really do believe that this sounded the death knell. This accelerated the problems that radio would go on to have. Just my opinion.
Well, and I think even further than that, as far as the creative aspect, they got to a point where if you had told me in 1986 that the rock station that I listened to would still be playing in the year 2019, Hotel California, Panama, Highway to Hell, and, Wish You Were Here 4 times a day, every day, I would have never believed you. But they've not, it's the same songs that I heard in the mid-'80s. They have not changed one iota. And they got a list of...
This is back to killing the goose that laid the golden egg.
Right.
One of the things that makes good radio is the ability to take a chance on new music.
Sure.
Okay? When I was a consultant, and contrary to all the myths about consultants, I never did cookie-cutter formats. I never did one station that sounded like 10 others.
Sure.
I always did what was right for each city.
Okay.
And the ability to take a chance on a new artist, the ability to play something that maybe is never going to be a national hit, but this band is really popular locally, that's what makes a station special. I
Absolutely.
don't hear a lot of that anymore. And what makes me particularly sad is I ask my students, okay? When I was growing up, I couldn't imagine a better job than being a radio DJ.
Mm-hmm.
I ask my students about radio. They don't listen to it.
Right.
They don't want to be DJs. It doesn't even occur to them that there's anything there except when they're in the car and their mommy and daddy make them listen to it.
Right.
And I think that's just so unfortunate because, again, there are certain stations, even now, that are live and local and that are the lifeblood of the community.
There are.
But there aren't enough of them. There aren't enough of them. And that breaks my heart. I miss radio every day of my life, okay?
I'm almost hoping that's the future, is because if we can get past the Clear Channel, iHeartMedia, conglomerate radio stations that have been playing the same 20 songs for 25 years, I would like to see radio get back into a more local scene. And because you're right, there is nothing glamorous about being an iHeartMedia DJ. You're literally, you're not doing anything. And this is not a discredit to those individuals.
No, I'm not going to diss iHeart because of the fact that I know people that work there.
Sure.
But my point is there's a certain conglomerate mentality of how will this affect the bottom line?
Right.
So if I fire a bunch of DJs and then just, voice track or syndicate,
right.
I've saved a bunch of bucks.
Right.
Yeah, but you've lost the local flavor of your community.
Right.
And if you're going to compete with Pandora and Spotify, you got to have personality. People still like personality DJs. People still like the folks that know their city, the folks that are out in the market. I don't think we'll ever be able to turn back the clock and have radio be what it was. But people have been predicting the death of radio since 1927. Okay, when talking pictures came along.
Right.
And then when television came along, and then when the internet came along.
Right.
But the Telecom Act just accelerated what was already a trend and didn't have to be.
Right.
We could have fought it. We could have done something. But as I said, this made a ton of bucks for a handful of people.
Right.
And lost an awful lot of listeners. That's my opinion.
No, absolutely, absolutely. It's a shame, and I hope it'll return to form, because that's one thing that, like corporate radio, streaming cannot match local radio programming for that. Streaming and all those things cannot identify a hometown market, what's popular there, what is important to that local town or city. They just can't. They can't service
and
that
each
small
city
area.
has their particular quirks. Each
Or
city
flavor, right.
has something that somebody voice tracking from 50 miles or 100 miles or 500 miles away. Yeah, they can read it online. They can go over to, they can go on YouTube or do a Google search. But that's not the same as being there.
Right.
I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to visit a lot of the cities that I went to when I was a consultant. And I saw a different side of those cities than you get from doing a Google search.
Right.
So, yes, it is true that a good announcer sitting in Detroit can, look up what's happening in Boston and read the Boston weather. But do you know about the argument that the governor just had with the police chief yesterday, or
Right.
you know about what the mayor just said about blah, 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 or,
Right.
they were just standing out in front of Fenway Park a couple of hours ago, and what were they all doing? You can speak to it, okay? I have been to Memphis, so I know some things about Memphis.
Sure.
But I don't for a minute pretend that I know as much about Memphis as somebody who lives there.
Right.
Those people are the ones who can do the best live and local radio.
I was on radio in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. And I've lived in a lot of places, but I'd only been in Cincinnati for about 6 months. And I had to read the traffic in the mornings, and I used to hate it because every place has its peculiarities on how they pronounce certain street names and that kind of thing.
When I got to Cleveland, oh
Right.
my God.
And so I would be
reading
reading street names, and I'd be like, oh, everybody in the city's got it. Like, this guy ain't from here. So you throw an Atlanta guy, up
Well, I can always tell who's from out of town by how they pronounce Worcester.
Exactly. That's a great point. That's a perfect example. Exactly. So talk about.
As I said, we got Worcester, we got Gloucester.
Right.
If you're in Pennsylvania, you got, I think, Schuylkill or something like that. It's like Shilekill, but it's Schuylkill.
Right.
Every city's got one.
Exactly.
But I digress. You digress. All God's children digress. Let's talk about songwriting before people throw themselves at their podcasting device and go, "You're disappointing me. You're not talking about songwriting."
Well, this ties in perfectly talking about songwriting because
this is why you pay me the big bucks.
Exactly. As many people know, you were presented a copy of the debut Rush album, 1974. What I've wondered about, and I'm sure you've explained this, ad nauseum, but you started playing Working Man on the radio, which led to a lot of people getting to know Rush, and I'm sure they, confused with Led Zeppelin and stuff at first, but you started playing Working Man, and I get that the lyrics kind of fit in with the Cleveland blue-collar city type thing, but I've always wondered, as a radio personality, and you knew what was concise and what was playable, I mean, did things like Finding My Way and other things off that album strike you first as a better single?
Actually, I wasn't looking for a single.
Okay.
When you're
looking for a bathroom break song?
Yeah, when you're working for an album rock station, which I was, WMMS was album rock. So I was just looking for great songs, great album tracks, what used to be called album.
Right.
So I didn't have the limitation of, oh my God, I need something that's 3 minutes long, has a good beat, and is easy to dance to. If I were a top 40 music director, then yes, what I would have been listening for is, has this got a good beat? Is this a good ballad? I was always taught for top 40, a song should either make them want to dance or make them want to cry.
Right.
One or the other. Okay. It's like those two emotions. It's either got to have a beat or it's got to be just like teardrops and, everybody's just reaching for their handkerchief. So in album rock, you don't have those constraints.
Okay.
In album rock, you're just looking for good songs that are right for your audience. I chose Working Man, as I've said on many occasions. Jokingly, we used to call long songs bathroom songs because when a DJ was alone at the station at night and nature called,
right.
the first thing I always looked for when I got an album was, does it have any good long songs? But notice, the word there is good.
Right.
If it wasn't a good song, I didn't care if it was 7 minutes long, okay? I didn't want to play it. There were plenty of songs that were long and awful, and they never saw the light of day on our radio station. There were other songs that were short, and they were amazing, and so we played them.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have that constraint.
Okay.
When I checked out Working Man, I liked the lyrics. I thought the lyrics would resonate with a Cleveland audience. But I chose Finding My Way just because it was a great rock and roll song, and we were a rock and roll station.
Right.
So sometimes you look for something that resonates. Sometimes you look for something that you can imagine people being at a concert singing along. You know, like you may remember Freebird from way back when.
Mm-hmm.
And people would go to concerts and yell, Freebird! I'm always looking for songs that would have some staying power.
Sure.
That people a few months from now would be going to a concert and going, I want to hear that one. And I just kind of figured that Working Man and Finding My Way would be the two best on the album. But we also played Here Again, which is a great ballad, power ballad. And we played In the Mood a few times. It was awful, but it had a good beat. It was easy to dance to. Mm-hmm. It was the guy's first attempt to do a radio-friendly single. And that's fine. You know, I knew what that was. But we didn't have to play it. Right. We could just play the album tracks that we thought were the best. And that's what I tried to play as a music director.
Now, you stayed a huge support of the band throughout the years. And
we were friends for more than 4 decades. I'm still in touch with them.
And I am a huge Rush fan. I always have been. Was it hard? You know, we talk about like you play what was good, not necessarily what was commercial, what was concise, but there's got to be limitations on that. Like, what was your reaction when they released, like, you know, Hemispheres? But like when they started expanding, going into like Hemispheres and Farewell to Kings. Of course, Farewell to Kings had some radio friendly stuff. But like, what was your reaction? Like, there's literally nothing I can play off this. Like, you're not going to play. Probably most stations are not going to play Cygnus X1 or things like that. I mean, were you still like, heck yes, go your own way and go as far as you can, or you're like, oh, I wish they had something I could still put in circulation airways?
That's a very good question. Let me answer it like this. As a music director of an album rock station, I had the freedom late at night to program some of the more far out kind of cuts, okay?
Sure.
So if something was not necessarily radio friendly, it didn't mean we couldn't play it.
Sure.
It just meant we maybe played it late at night. Because late at night, people have different expectations. They're partying, they're doing whatever they do late at night. They're not at work. And so that's what we would do with some of that stuff.
Okay.
But in the case of some songs, in my mind, I'm thinking, this is going to be for concerts, okay?
Right.
They're going to play this at one of their shows. They're a hardworking band. They're out on the road all the time. And God bless them, you know? So I always looked at it like, by that time, these are my friends, all right? And I've gotten to know them. I've gotten to know their man to take whatever musical direction they need to take. Now, they themselves would ultimately rein themselves in when they got too far afield, all right?
They did,
If you watched the documentary Beyond the Lighted Stage, which I had the privilege of being in, they talk about that. They're like, yeah, we went off on some tangents and, you know, gradually we had to look at it and just go, ooh, maybe not. But
that's the exploration of youth. It's the exploration of youth and finding what works for you as an artist. I think it was a necessary journey.
Yes. And the same with me as a radio DJ or a music director. I've got to pick the songs that are the right songs for my audience and my station. But as I said, there's different songs that are right for different times of the day. And I have that flexibility.
That makes sense.
Late at night, for example, I might play a live in-concert version of something that goes on for like 15 minutes and has a long drum solo. A really good song. And people are going to, you know, people that are really super fans of this band, they're going to love this thing.
Right.
And during the day, only the super fans are going to love this. So
exactly. No, you're right. It's just about having the common sense to know what audience would work for what. Like when I normally did drive time on the radio. Did the 6 to 9 slot, the morning show. So I could play what I wanted, but was I going to play side one from Tales of Topographic Oceans from Yes? No.
Welcome back, my friends, to the album that never ends.
Exactly. Right.
One.
I'm not playing that because you're just going to tune people out. You're going to test their patience. But I want to ask you another thing that we didn't discuss earlier, but I'm been curious. The band I know, and this is only from interviews and videos and that kind of thing. I know Neil as not reticent, but reserved and kind of stoic.
Shy, S-H-Y, shy.
Okay, shy. Okay, was he like?
No, people don't think that. Okay, but then again, people are listening to me tonight, and they're like, "Wow, wish I had her self-confidence." If you saw me at a party, I would be the one sitting over in a corner somewhere, not talking to anyone. I am famously shy.
Okay.
When I'm performing, oh yeah, you kidding me? I can give a talk in front of 500 people and not even think twice about it.
That makes
Neil
sense.
can get up in front of an audience of like 15,000 people and play his heart out for hours. But when it comes to socializing, rather not.
Did he have
with a few close friends, maybe. Other than that, not so much. I keep that line in Limelight about I can't pretend the stranger is a long-awaited friend. It's very real for him. He's just very, very reserved.
Sure.
And he has a certain group of friends.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm the same way.
Yeah,
I've got a handful of friends, and I try very hard to be loyal to them. But in terms of like, do I have millions of people that love me and want to be? No, I don't. I really don't.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I've known that about it. I wonder if he was a little bit less reserved when he was younger, and he just sort of, with fame, decided that his shyness, he needed to kind of keep a barrier around himself. Not a barrier, but he decided to set parameters for himself. Does that make sense?
From what he has told me, he always was all about the music. Okay.
Sure.
He was very, very focused on the music. Drumming for him was almost like a calling. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like I talked earlier about Harry Levy, the rabbi that was on the radio.
Right.
Hey, Rabbi Levy didn't want to be famous.
Right.
He couldn't have cared less about being famous. He just really loved the Bible, and he loved being able to talk about it. And being able to talk about it on the radio, wow, you get to talk to more people. But he never expected that hundreds of people would show up wanting his autograph. Right. Neil wanted to be a drummer. He loved drumming. It was an art for him. He studied the famous drummers. He wanted to be the best drummer he could possibly be, not so that people would give him drugs and not so that people would like fall at his feet, but because he demanded of himself that he be the best drummer he could be. And when he auditioned to be in Rush, he wanted to take Rush to the next level. He wanted to write songs. He wanted to be the kind of drummer who wasn't just behind on the podium there, just banging away. It was an art for him. And if he became famous, marvelous. If he didn't become famous, marvelous. The main thing he was concerned about is he wanted his peers and the people in his band to believe that he had made a difference. Right. And to this day, he's a musician's musician. Other drummers are like, wow, wish I could play like him.
Oh, yeah.
And he's he's been untouched by it, okay? He never was the kind of person who was like, don't you know who I am? Right. It's never been him at all, okay? Now that he's retired and he thinks of himself as a retired drummer, people still look in awe at some of the performances he did, and it never fazed him. He was the guy that was in the Tim Horton eating donuts along with Getty and Alex. I mean, they were just these three down-to-earth guys who loved music, who loved rock and roll, and who weren't necessarily in it to become rich and famous. I mean, rich and famous is nice. You can buy nice things for your family, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But the commitment to the musicianship, the commitment to the songwriting, that drove him. And I'm not trying to put words in his mouth. That's the impression I got from the conversations we had.
No, that makes perfect sense to me. It does. Now, I know I'm going to switch gears a little bit, Donna. You've been a professor and you teach a lot. As far as journalism goes, and that could be radio, TV, newspaper, do you think there's been a decline in the art of unbiased journalism? Because I certainly do, just in recent years.
I do and I don't.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. And I'm not trying to beg the question.
No.
Okay. I think the big problem, and I get asked this a lot.
Oh, do you? Okay.
I think the big problem is that a lot of people can't separate commentators from reporters.
Okay, makes sense.
Years ago, there was like a brick wall between them, okay? There was mistaking who was a commentator and who was a reporter. They weren't even in the same newscast, okay? You never would have seen Walter Cronkite or, Dan Rather or Edward R. Murrow tossing to a commentator like, hey, Joe, what do you think about what I just said? It wouldn't have happened, okay? Now, later in the show, there might have been a commentator to talk about what they had just said. But that person was nowhere near the reporter, didn't even sit at the same desk, okay? Today, it is completely common, particularly on cable news, for reporters to talk to commentators and commentators to talk to reporters, reporters to be commentators and commentators to be reporters. You and I are kind of in the weeds about these things because we're in the industry, so we understand how the sausage is made. The average person, they just saw somebody giving an opinion, given an NBC. NBC is a station that has a newscast, so that commentator must be a reporter.
Right.
And I hear that relentlessly. I really think one of the big problems with our internet age is people want to get it right now. They want it immediately.
Right.
They don't care if the story has completely been reported out or if we have all the facts. They want the information right now. Thank you very much. Right. Another big problem is the fact that we have now got parallel media. Okay? So there's a big problem which is called confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Okay? So if you think Donald Trump is the best president ever, you probably watch Fox News, and you probably listen to Rush Limbaugh, and you probably take Sean Hannity very seriously because they tell you that you're right. He's the best president ever.
Right. It makes you feel good because I knew it. I knew I was right.
Absolutely. If you believe Barack Obama was a great president, or whoever, fill in the blank here, you're going to seek out networks, commentators, magazines, newspapers that tell you you're right.
Right.
When I was growing up, and it wasn't that long ago, when I was growing up, there were a basic group of newscasts. Everyone had a shared set of facts. Now, there may be different interpretations of those facts, but the facts were the facts.
Right.
Today, you've got fact and opinion mingling on so many different outlets, and you've got people twisting and distorting the facts.
Right.
And you have people who firmly believe that opinion is fact.
Right.
And so when President Trump, and again, I'm using him as an example because he's in office. If you had done this interview when Obama was in office, I would have been using Obama.
Absolutely.
Please don't beat me up on
No.
I'm using the example of who's in office.
Right.
Okay. So when President Trump says X, even if I can prove that, no, that didn't happen that way, his believers are going to go to the channels and the magazines and the newspapers and go, no, the way he said it is what really happened.
Right.
And the rest of us are like, no, that isn't what happened.
But it's
we're
really
not talking interpretation here. We're talking facts.
It's really leading to a division of the country because you've got half the country believing this, half the country believing this, and they're being spoon fed by opposite factions. And
Absolutely.
I don't even know.
Moynihan, he didn't really say it first, but he's credited with saying everybody is entitled to their own opinion,
but
no one is entitled to their own facts.
And
if he were alive today, he'd be spinning in his grave.
Well, I don't even know if they're teaching.
Mixing a metaphor, but today people do believe they're entitled to their own facts, and if facts don't match up with what they believe, they just seek out people that will tell them what they want to hear. Right. So that's the problem. It
It
is
is.
harder and harder for journalists today to be objective because they're getting pulled into this game of, well, which side are you on? I'm on the side where I'm trying to be fair to the facts, and I'm trying not to get out in front of the facts. And you want the facts to be a certain way, and I can't do that for you. I just can't.
Well, it's the 21st century version of yellow journalism.
Yep.
And I don't know if they're teaching kids about yellow journalism nowadays.
Last week.
Do you? Well, good.
Come
Okay.
to my journalism class.
Okay. Well, good. But that's good. I'm glad it's still being taught. But the fact that they're speaking of
scandal and sensationalism sells.
Remember the Maine.
It's been around. By the way, did you know that the term fake news, we can trace it back to 1894?
I did not know that.
Okay. Oh yeah, there are cartoons in the 1890s talking about fake news, and what they were talking about was yellow journalism. Okay, right. In fact, we've got the term. The first time I see it is in the 1880s. It didn't really start taking off till the 1890s when yellow journalism was a big thing. But yeah, scandal, sensationalism, all of this stuff is as old as time. The difference? Social media and the internet,
right,
where you can spread a rumor or come up with a meme. I mean, when Hillary Clinton, like her or hate her, okay, again, this is not about Hillary, this is about memes. When Hillary Clinton was running for president, I saw so many memes online with fake quotes, okay? And I'm sitting there like, she never said this. If you don't like her, fine, don't vote for her. But don't put words in her mouth.
But it's true on both sides, and it's...
Yes, and I'm just, again, using her because she ran for president. But these things get sent around, and people who have not been taught critical thinking, they get it. They forwarded it to everyone they know.
Right.
And this is how misinformation's, and you're right, both sides do it. And it's not just about politics.
No.
The big thing we are competing with is we are competing with memes. We're competing with fake quotes. We're like dealing with fake information, distorted information, bad edits, and people who want it now, want it fast, and don't take the time to fact check.
Right.
I sent around something last week on my Facebook page. It shows Abraham Lincoln holding a cell phone. And next to him is the quote, "It's really a problem verifying quotes on the internet." Abraham Lincoln.
Right. I read a similar one, like, don't believe everything you read on the internet. Abraham Lincoln, yes. Yeah.
Yep. And also George Washington. "It's really hard to tell what the facts are. Would you like some alternative facts?" You know? So just because somebody's name and a quote are circulated around, I beg you, take a couple of minutes to fact check and find out if the person really said it. So, long story short, the bottom line is not that journalism is in the crapper. The bottom line is that we are dealing with a moment in our culture when there are a lot of people who would prefer what makes them feel good rather than what's factual. And
no, I think you're...
a lot of problems in our society today don't have easy answers. I have friends who are righties. I have friends who are lefties. I have friends who are libertarians. We talk about the issues all the time. And in many cases, we don't come away with a solution.
No.
Because there isn't it isn't a simple matter. Well, if you just do this, it would all be fine. No, it wouldn't.
Right.
So there's a lot of difficult problems in our culture. We're not going to solve them by calling each other names. Right. If you've ever followed me on social media, you'll notice I do not name call. I do not insult people. If you start insulting me, I will block you. Just because it isn't productive use of my time to engage in insulting each other.
I think it's just something...
rather find out how it is for you. Tell me what you feel. Tell me what you believe. Let me have some respect for your point of view, and then we can exchange opinions, okay?
I think societies start to...
We're just not in that moment. We're just not in... Oh, you're a liberal. No,
right.
I'm not. I'm Donna. And there's things I'm liberal about, and there's things I'm conservative about, and there's things that I genuinely don't care about one way or the other, and so on and so on. But if you try to put me in a little box, you'll never get to know me as a person, is all I'm saying.
Right. I think we are in a weird segment of history because in this era of instant gratification, it's hard to get people to accept anything. The confirmation bias is so easy because you can obtain it like that in any of a multitude of ways. Where generations before, if you went back to our great-grandparents, they had the exact same tools and technology that their great-great-great-great-grandfather had. And in the span of the 20th century to the 21st century, things have just exponentially increased. Where
absolutely.
We are...
And the danger here, and it's not just with politics. I have a blog.
I've read some of it, yeah.
And down the Alex and Getty are getting back together again, and they're going to have a new drummer, and it's going to be Rush. And it's like, no. Mm-mm. Turns out somebody said something on a rock show where he was just like speculating.
Right.
Somebody took the speculation, turned it into, oh my God, Rush are getting back together again. Right. And everybody's off to the races, sending me emails. Oh my God, I just heard online that Rush are getting back together again. And oh my God, does anybody fact check anymore?
Right.
And so I got in touch with Alex, and I'm like, Alex, I must have been asleep the day you decided to get back together with Getty and Neil. I thought Neil was retired. Right. And he was like, oh God, I go through this every day of my life.
I'm sure.
And yeah, so the truth is, no, they're not getting back together.
Right.
Yes, Getty and Alex would like to collaborate on a project at some point, but the chances of Rush reuniting, and all the memes in the world are not going to make them reunite any faster.
They are 150% entitled to retire and enjoy their life. I mean, not only have they been around since 1974, but they've been prolific since 1974.
Absolutely. And they gave their heart and soul to us.
Absolutely.
They did a wonderful job. Let them have the kind of life they want to have. If they want to get back together again, marvelous. But if they don't, marvelous. I'm fine about it. I really am. Yes, I miss them, but I miss a lot of things, okay? Sometimes you got to know when to go out. I wrote a blog post about this, and Neil talked about this. He said, I want to go out on top. I don't want to go out like a parody of myself.
Right.
I don't want to be playing till I'm 90 and people are like, oh my God, those guys can't play anymore. They can't hit the high notes. Why are they even there? A lot of classic bands, and so have you, that it's like, oh my God, you should have retired, guys.
There are.
And they just wanted to go out at their best.
Okay, and Donna, on that note, I would love for you to let our listeners know what's the best way for them to find out more about the books you've authored, where they can learn more about you, that kind of thing, social media things.
Oh my God, a quick Google search will probably turn up a whole bunch of stuff about me. I have a website, which is www.donnahalper.com, because why not?
Makes sense.
I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I blog. I have a faculty website at the university where I teach. And I can be emailed at dlh@donnahalper.com, DONNAHALPER.com. Always happy to hear from people. I'm sorry my voice is dying on me here, but these things happen. So It's allergy season. The pollen is just brutal. But thank you so much for having me.
Oh, Don, it's been my absolute pleasure. It's been a fascinating talk, and I'm looking forward to us chatting further in the future and learning some more from you, because you definitely got a ton of fantastic stories and experiences to share. So it's been an honor for me.
Well, thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.